Number 1.
She was born on August 18, 1587, and was the first English child born in the New World. Dare's parents were part of Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition to explore and settle land in North America on behalf of the English crown. Their fate is a mystery that historians and tourists still clamor to know more about. First, let's set the stage. It's 1584 and Catholic Spain and Protestant England are locked in a global power struggle. Spain has explored and claimed new lands in North America, gaining clout with each new discovery. However, they do not have the manpower or supplies to maintain the lands they've already claimed. Meanwhile, England's enjoying a period of stability with Elizabeth I at the helm, following years of civil war, and is ready to explore. Queen Elizabeth believed that if England could get a foothold in America, it would be possible to cut off the flow of gold, silver, and sugar that fueled Spain's domination and threatened England's security. No one really knows. A few clues left behind come from a logbook kept by John White. He found the letters Crow carved on a tree by the water's edge and Croton carved on a post without any cross or sign of distress near it. Another clue was found in 2012 when historians located a symbol under a paper patch on a map, one of White's drawings, which may indicate a place the colonists may have headed toward when they left Roanoke. Many experts believe that members of the colony were taken in by Manteo and his Croton tribesmen. Manteo had already proven a valuable ally to the English, having traveled in England in 1584 to outline geography and resources in the New World to Elizabeth I's court. It certainly seems like one of the most plausible theories. Other theories about the fate of the colonists include a deadly war with neighboring tribes, famine and disease, and the possibility that the colonists tried to go back to England and were lost at sea. In the absence of firm answers, the colony's disappearance has spurred many legends. The most enduring of which is about Virginia Dare as the White Doe. According to the legend, Virginia Dare was taken in by the Croton tribe and grew into a beautiful young woman named Winona Ska. Akisco, the handsome Indian chieftain, wanted to marry her, but Chico, a powerful medicine man, wanted Winona for his own. When Chico did not win Winona Ska's affections, he cast a spell to turn her into a white doe. If she wouldn't be his, no other man could have her either. Akisco was determined to undo the evil magic of Chico's spell and found a magician who helped make him an arrow with a pearl tip. If Akisco shot the white doe through the heart with the pearl-tipped arrow, the spell would be broken and Winona Ska would be human again. Unfortunately for Akisco, word spread to other tribes about the elusive and mysterious white doe. For months, the doe eluded even the best warriors. Eventually, the chief of another tribe, Winchese, called for a hunt to kill the creature. Winchese armed himself with a silver arrow, a gift from Queen Elizabeth Anne, believed it would do the job. Spotting the white doe, both Akisco and Winchese shot their arrows from opposite directions at the exact same time and pierced the white doe's heart. Akisco's pearl-tipped arrow transformed the doe back into Winona Ska, but Winchese's arrow pierced her human heart, killing her. In despair, Akisco ran to the magic fountain that had helped create his pearl-tipped arrow and threw both arrows into the water, where he begged for Winona Ska's life, but it was for naught. As with many legends and folklore tales, the ending of this story has several variations. Some versions say that her body disappeared and a white doe was seen hastening away. Others say that Akisco picked up Winona Ska's lifeless body, buried her in the fort where she was born, and from her blood, the Scuppernong mother vine grew. One thing that is consistent is that people continue to report seeing a ghostly white doe near the area where the lost colony first settled on Roanoke Island.
Number 2.
Owen Parfitt had lived a wild life by anybody's standards. He told tales of his youth that featured piracy and great battles and numerous women. Most people were skeptical of his stories, and he undoubtedly knew that, but it didn't stop him from recounting his glory days nonetheless. By the 1760s, Owen was in his 60s, and people said his wild living had caught up with him. He was now a virtual cripple, living with his elderly sister in Shepton Mallet, a town in southwest England. For a man who was used to moving freely from one adventure to another, the paralysis must have come as a heavy burden. He would have one final adventure that would capture the attention of Shepton Mallet and neighboring villages. The date is sketchy. Some sources claim the following took place in June of 1763, while others place it in 1768. Regardless, we do know that on a warm evening Owen Parfitt wanted to sit outside. Due to his virtual immobility, he needed the assistance of his sister and a neighbor to carry him out into a chair on the front porch. When his sister returned into the house, Owen was sitting placidly in the chair. Across the road, a very short distance away, several farm workers were laboring within easy earshot of Owen. Certainly if someone had approached him where he sat on the porch, somebody would have seen something. Nobody saw a thing. A storm was coming that evening, and so Owen's sister came out onto the porch to bring him back inside. But he was no longer in the chair. Knowing that he could not have moved anywhere by himself, she asked the farm workers if they had seen someone come get him, but none of them had. Panicking, the sister enlisted the help of the farm workers and neighbors to search the area. It wasn't possible Owen could have left on his own, so it seemed he would be easily found. Impossibly, they never found a trace of the crippled man. Over time, neighbors passed along tales about what had happened to him, including that he'd been taken by the devil or that pirates carried him off in order to get him to tell the location of buried treasure. Owen's incredible disappearance was never solved and became a popular piece of local lore. The story would fade but became local news again in 1813 when some routine construction in Shepton Mallet unearthed a human skeleton. Everybody jumped to the conclusion that it must be Owen's remains, and theories were put forward as to how Owen's body had come to such an undignified end. The medical community nipped the gossip in the bud, however, when it stated that the skeleton was that of a young female. Another episode of construction in the area in 1933 shed no new light on Owen's fate. He remains one of southwest England's most intriguing mysteries.
Number 3.
Ambrose Bierce was a bitter old man in 1913. He drank like a fish and spewed invective like a volcano. Hot-tempered, sarcastic and vain, he had alienated his friends and failed as a writer. At 71, he seemed justly destined for oblivion. Then he made a great career move. Saddling up his horse in El Paso, Texas, he crossed the Rio Grande, riding into the maw of the Mexican Revolution. Sometime after Christmas, near Chihuahua City where warlord Pancho Villa was operating, the former San Francisco newspaperman vanished. Intentional or not, Bierce's disappearance proved to be a masterstroke, more enigmatic than a UFO abduction, murkier than a Beirut kidnapping. It imparted mystique to the man and helped spark interest in his dark, angry fiction, a handful of bleak, brooding, bloody Civil War stories and short horror fantasies, oozing a preoccupation with death. Bierce's fate became an enduring mystery and literary legend, the American writer devoured by a historical black hole. Almost certainly, Bierce, best known for his vitriolic The Devil's Dictionary, perished in a current of revolutionary violence. But there was no evidence. Theories abounded. He had been shot by Villa. He had returned to the United States and lived in anonymity or died in an insane asylum. He was killed in the siege of a Mexican town in January 1914. He took his own life, fulfilling his endorsement of suicide as a noble act. The riddle of his fate has stumped all comers. Secret Service agents, Pinkerton detectives, newspaper reporters, scholars and amateur sleuths. Most recently, novelist Carlos Fuentes speculated on the end of Bierce in The Old Gringo, adapted into a much-panned 1989 movie starring Gregory Peck and Jane Fonda. Nearly 80 years after Bierce cantered into limbo, James Robertson walked into San Francisco's Albatross bookshop, where he stumbled onto a potential solution to the Bierce puzzle. A publisher of expensive limited edition books, Robertson was planning a lavish volume of Bierce's Civil War fiction, one of the missing tales of the war between the states. At any rate, while in the bookshop, Robertson discovered a biography of the short story writer and newspaper columnist, written by a former drinking buddy, an obscure San Francisco dentist named Adolphe Danziger de Castro. As he does with every project undertaken by Yala Boli Press of Cabello, 4 hours north of San Francisco, Robertson learned all he could about Bierce and his work. It wasn't always easy. Robertson found de Castro's 1928 effort almost unreadable. In fact, the self-serving book is so bad that one Bierce expert reportedly couldn't finish it. But Robertson persisted. And at the end, he found what he believes is gold. De Castro's account of his interview with Pancho Villa some years after Bierce's disappearance. Traveling to Mexico, de Castro went to Villa's hacienda, where he had dinner with the Mexican revolutionary. Nervous in the presence of so many armed, glowering men, de Castro gently and obliquely raised the topic of Bierce. Wisely, de Castro pretended to be an enemy of Bierce, who had allegedly taken a woman from the dentist. "It would have given me pleasure to put a bullet in the heart of an American who was serving with your forces, my general," de Castro recalled telling Villa. "It is probably too late, for that devil was old in sin, and no woman was safe with him." When Villa learned the name of the scoundrel, de Castro reports that Villa responded, "I knew him. He will not bother you and your woman anymore. He has passed." Villa also told de Castro that Bierce had not changed his drunken, loudmouth ways and had criticized nearly all the officers in his army. "I treated his vaporings with contempt," Villa said. "An American who drinks too much tequila soon loses himself." After the dinner broke up, Villa's brother Hippolito provided another outburst against Bierce. "This old cabron, bastard, sat for days drinking tequila and in his drunkenness criticized my brother. Imagine this." Satisfied that he had learned as much as he safely could and anxious to get away, De Castro took his leave, saving the tale for his Bierce biography. From what he has learned of Bierce's psychology, Robertson believes De Castro's account is not only plausible but has an odor of authenticity about it. He has been promoting this opinion in lectures about Bierce, including a recent talk to the Book Club of California in San Francisco. In his heyday, Bierce was well known in the Bay Area for his temper and for his reputation as a crack shot with a .44 caliber pistol, Robertson says. He was very easily offended. Apparently, he had one of the world's shorter fuses. Thus, he might have insulted a revolutionary general, might even have enjoyed it despite the consequences. Moreover, he was accustomed to violence, having served with distinction as a Union volunteer in the Civil War. He fought at Shiloh, was promoted from the ranks to lieutenant and was wounded 3 times. Bierce also had a lifelong preoccupation with death and suicide. At 16, he had a dream in which God and mankind had died, and he saw his own decomposing corpse, a scene later included in one of his short stories. As an adult, he frequently spoke in support of suicide. His stories often hinged on bizarre death, and he was fascinated with patricide and matricide. One of his tales begins. "Early one June morning in 1872, I murdered my father, an act which made a deep impression on me at the time." Shortly before he left this country, Bierce visited the battlefields where he had fought a farewell tour by a man who might have been seeking his own death. Robertson notes too that Bierce had endured the death of 2 sons and a host of professional disappointments. At one time, Bierce claimed he had made less than $100 from his now acclaimed fiction. But Robertson also concedes that De Castro was a suspicious character. Based on the biography of Bierce, De Castro wanted to inflate his reputation as much as Bierce's, Robertson says. Trying to find out more about the dentist from other sources, Robertson was able to find only one detail. De Castro was arrested once in Los Angeles for impersonating a physician. On the other hand, historian Page Smith, author of The People's History of the United States, writes in the introduction to One of the Missing that De Castro's rendition of Bierce's fate has a certain plausibility. But Smith steers away from endorsing the story. In any event, he sealed his earthly fame by the manner in which he departed the planet, Smith writes. He became more famous in death than he had been in life and cast about his name a splendid cloak of mystery that will ever allure. But perhaps Bierce should have the last word. In one of his final letters, he wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it is a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia."
Number 4.
This is a tale of presence and absence. A mystery, a fantasy. It begins more than a century ago, on 4 March 1914, in a small house in Hanover, New Hampshire, when a child called Barbara Newell Follett was born. Or perhaps it begins in 1918, when she was 4. See in your mind's eye a small girl standing silent outside the door of her father's study. She can hear music. Curious taps and clicks and whirs and tings of a small bell. She knows what she is hearing is the music of writing. And even at the age of 4 she understands how this music translates to words, how words gather to become stories, and she wants this with the clear sharp focus of a fierce 4-year-old. So she waits, and later, when she hears her parents talking downstairs, their voices muffled by distance, she creeps back to her father's study, wraps her arms around the object of her desire, and carries the typewriter back to her room. 4 years old. And now she is a writer. Barbara had always loved stories. She learned to read in the way that most children learn to walk, a natural process, not a taught one. And as much as she loved reading and writing, she also loved spending time outside, in wild places. The two passions grew side by side and frequently intertwined, as she often composed poems and stories about the natural world. It was Barbara's custom, on her own birthday, to give her mother a gift. At the age of 8 she decided that on her 9th birthday this gift would take the form of a book. And so, alone in her room, with the door shut tight, she worked at her typewriter, shaping her tale until it was almost perfect. She was educated at home, so she had plenty of time to write. Day after day, week after week, she wrote. She hoped to make a handful of copies to share with friends, but the original copy was for her mother. It was a story about a small child in the wilderness. It was called The House Without Windows. Just a few days after she finished writing, while the family were sleeping, a fire broke out in the kitchen. The Follets were lucky to escape with their lives. Most of their belongings were destroyed, along with the fresh manuscript, so lovingly typed. Every word Barbara had written gone. At this point many children would have given up. Not Barbara. Immediately she began the long task of reconstructing her story, word by carefully chosen word, from memory. 3 years she spent, sometimes leaving her text for months at a time, but always returning to it, frustrated and determined in equal measure. Eventually, she stopped trying to remember the original and began to imagine anew, letting her mind run wild once again. Barbara wrote of a little girl called Ipersip, who loves the outdoors as much as she did, who doesn't want to be confined in a house with walls and windows, binding her life. The world of brick and glass is too restrictive for the wild child, and Ipersip longs to shed the trappings of civilization. So she runs away from home. She runs first to the meadow, then to the sea, and last to the mountains, and she gives her heart in equal measure to all of them. She lives in these wild places without fear, learning how to be free, and she sees joy and glory everywhere. In 1926, Barbara was 12, and the book was finally complete, again. Her father was so impressed that he took the manuscript to work with him. He was, at this time, working for the publisher Alfred Knopf. Imagine the excitement when a blue letter arrived, and within it the offer to publish Barbara's story. 2,500 copies were printed, and all sold out. Her story of Ipersip and her life in the house without windows went on to become a bestseller, and Barbara was hailed as a child genius. I first came across the book through a review. I tracked down a copy scuffed and well-read, with wonderful paper and deckled edges, and fell immediately in love. This is a book that demands to be read outside, in the open air. This is its natural habitat. It is clearly the work of a vibrant, untamed mind, filled with color, movement, fearlessness and beauty. I was struck by how Ipersip is equal to, and inseparable from, the natural world in which she lives. Success with a first novel is an unusual thing. Success at the age of 12 is almost unheard of. A child who had led a solitary life, Barbara took this success in her stride. She met her literary heroes and was photographed smiling beside them. She was interviewed on the radio and found herself being asked to review books such as Now We Are Six by A. A. Milne. But, like all good writers, by the time The House Without Windows was published, she had already fallen in love again. This time, it was with the sea. She had begun work on a book about pirates. Barbara threw herself into learning the names and shapes of sailing ships, sails, ropes and knots, all from her favorite Webster's dictionary. She studied the points of the compass, hoping they would point to a new direction for her restless imagination. But the dictionary and her imagination weren't enough. She knew that real-life experience informed the best passages of her stories. And she knew that she had to experience life on the water. She had to feel the salt wind in her face, the ropes against her hands, the sway of the hull. She had to sleep on the sea-rolled deck beneath a sky of stars. And so she set sail, without her parents and age just 13. Signing on as the cabin boy on a ship bound for Nova Scotia. A few months later she returned and handed in the manuscript of her second book. The Voyage of the Normandy. By 18, Barbara was hiking the Appalachian Trail in the company of a young man called Nickerson Rogers, each night sharing his small tent or lying together beneath the ceiling of stars. Later they traveled to Europe, wandering through Spain, France, Germany, sometimes working, always writing, keeping notes for future manuscripts. And what things they must have seen as they worked and walked their way through this turbulent time between the wars. On their return to America they settled into an apartment, marrying in 1934 and taking jobs. And Barbara began to feel her dreams slipping away to the familiar tune of work and domesticity. She still wrote, but her work was no longer in favor with publishers, and the rejections hurt. And then, in 1939, on 7 December, Barbara Rogers, née Newell Follett, walked out of the apartment she shared with her husband. She left no note, took only a few dollars and some shorthand notes. She was never seen again. Why? Where did she go? To the sea or the mountains? Barbara once joked with a friend that if life became too much she could always disappear. She could always make a new story to live in. Barbara's words and her spirit have haunted me for so long. To see the world through her young, bright eyes is a wonderful thing. To meet her soul, in Ipersip, and walk with her in the meadow, swim in the sea, sleep beneath a blanket of snow, across a century and a white ocean, is the purest magic. It is a magic she herself would have understood, the kind made by stories. Whenever I read her words, they paint the most extraordinary pictures in my mind. Back in 1927, it was suggested that The House Without Windows might be republished in an illustrated edition if it proved to be a success. I hope she would be pleased with what I have done, trying to catch the ghosts of her wild creatures in ink and in water. People search for Barbara in her archives, looking for the answer to the mystery of her absence. Some search for murder clues, others for signs of escape. Reader, do not look for Barbara there. Search instead in the pages of her stories. Hear her voice and listen. On summer days you can hear swallows call the name of Ypirsup, threading it through the sky. Look, if you have eyes to see and a heart to believe, between the wings of butterflies, and you will find her.
Number 5.
The village of Bennington, Vermont is an idyllic corner of New England that would have no particular notoriety were it not for Paula Jean Weldon. One chilly December afternoon in 1946, the 18-year-old sophomore left her room at Bennington College to go on a hike and was never seen again. The mystery began on December 1, 1946. Paula worked a double shift in the college dining hall, spent some time with her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, and then decided to go out for a while. According to Johnson, Paula was dressed in a distinctive red parka coat with a fur-lined hood, blue jeans, top-sider shoes with thick soles, and a gold Elgin wristwatch with a black band. She also remembered Paula's last words. "I'm all through with studies, I'm taking a long walk." Paula's long walk was to be along part of Vermont's Long Trail, which in total runs 272 miles from the Massachusetts state line to the Canadian border. The cold weather and Paula's outfit suggested that Paula hadn't planned on being out longer than a few hours. Shortly after, Paula, or a girl in similar clothing with the same physical description, was spotted by Danny Fager. Fager owned a gas station across the street from the college gates and alleged that he'd seen the girl run up and then down the side of a gravel pit near the college entrance. This would have occurred just after Paula's departure from her room, around 2:45 p.m. 15 minutes later, a man named Louis Knapp claimed to have picked up a young girl hitchhiking on Route 67A near the college. Knapp remembered her appearance as being consistent with Paula's and also recalled a seemingly insignificant exchange between himself and the girl. While climbing into his truck, the girl lost her footing. Knapp told her to be careful but said nothing else until letting her out on Route 9, near the Long Trail. Just before 4 p.m., Paula was again seen, this time by several people in Bickford Hollow, where she appeared to be heading toward the trail. One of those people, Ernie Whitman, warned Paula against traveling into the mountains without heavier clothing. She reportedly ignored him and continued on her way. By the time night fell, Paula's roommate started to worry. Not wanting to arouse any unnecessary panic, Johnson said nothing to college president Louis Webster Jones until the next morning. Jones phoned Paula's parents to ask if she'd gone home for the weekend. Paula's mother collapsed with worry and was confined to her bed. Paula's father, engineer W. Archibald Weldon, immediately left his Stamford, Connecticut home for Bennington. Upon arriving, Mr. Weldon sprang into action by organizing a massive search party, which included local residents as well as students from Bennington and nearby Williams College. After a full day had passed with no results, most of the students gave up in frustration. Mr. Weldon called in both the New York and Connecticut state police to help. Vermont had no state police force at the time, but it did have a state investigator named Almo Franzoni, whose involvement only served to raise a $5,000 reward for information. Days passed with no resolution. Bizarre leads surfaced in different areas, including one from a waitress in Fall River, Massachusetts, who claimed to have served dinner to a disturbed woman fitting Paula's description. Oddly, this struck a chord with Mr. Weldon. He vanished for 36 hours to pursue the lead. However, no one knew where Mr. Weldon had gone until he returned to Bennington. This made some people believe that Mr. Weldon was somehow connected to his daughter's disappearance. When other facts began to surface, Mr. Weldon looked even guiltier. Paula and her father reportedly had a falling out over a male suitor, of whom her father disapproved. Mr. Weldon soon theorized that Paula's boyfriend must be the responsible party, but could offer no proof to substantiate his claims other than to say a clairvoyant from Pownell, Vermont told him so. On December 16, Mr. Weldon admonished the police for their lack of professionalism and returned to Connecticut. He was particularly aghast that no records had been kept for the first 10 days of the investigation. Once reporters caught wind of this, they descended on Bennington and jotted down everything they could find. The negative press eventually led to the creation of the Vermont State Police in July 1947. Search parties continued on the Long Trail, but poor weather eventually forced the last willing participants to turn away, feeling that any last remains of Paula Jean Weldon would most likely be covered and undetectable. 9 years after Paula's disappearance, a lumberjack came forward. He claimed that he had been in Bickford Hollow when Paula went missing, and he also claimed to know where her body was buried. Attorney Reuben Levin questioned the man incessantly until the man admitted to making it all up for publicity. Then in 1968, a skeleton was found. Investigators scrambled excitedly, hoping to finally bring closure to the aging cold case. But again, their hopes were dashed. It was determined that the remains were far too old to be Paula. Independent analyses of the Paula Jean Weldon case have led to the usual conclusions. She became lost and died in the elements, or she ran off with a boyfriend. One of the eerier theories points to the Bennington Triangle, a notorious section of southwestern Vermont where 5 people, including Paula, vanished between 1945 and 1950. Individuals such as New England author Joseph Citro believe that Paula's disappearance has an otherworldly explanation. Officially, the unsolved case of Paula Jean Weldon remains open, though it is unlikely that it will ever be solved.
Number 6.
James E. Tedford, often referred to as Tetford, was born around 1884 in Vermont. Not much is known about his early life, but by 1940 he was resident in Fletchertown, Franklin, VT with his younger wife Pearl. She was aged 28 and he was 56. Things started to get strange following Tedford's return to Vermont, the end of his second spell of military service at the end of WW2. He returned to find his wife Pearl had vanished. No trace of her could be found. The property they rented in Fletchertown had been left abandoned. Tedford's family claimed no knowledge of the whereabouts of his missing wife. They said they had last seen her as she was heading to the Amoco store in Franklin, but they never saw her again. Desperate and lonely, Tedford checked into a soldier's home in Bennington sometime around 1947. On December 1, 1949, Tedford's remaining family reported him missing. Police investigations and reports show he boarded a bus in St. Albans a few days earlier, but that he had not arrived at his destination. Tedford had vanished mysteriously during the last part of the trip. Tedford was on his way home to the retirement home in Bennington from a trip to see family in St. Albans, Vermont. The scheduled bus trip should have taken the best part of 8 hours, but heavy snow caused a long delay. The route also passed through the Green Mountain National Forest, an area renowned for disappearances and strange events during the 1940s. Tedford was seen sitting on the bus by 14 other passengers. They all testified to seeing him there, sleeping in his seat. When the bus reached its destination, however, Tedford was gone, and the driver and other witnesses all testified that they had not seen the old man leave the bus. Tedford was seen getting on the bus in St. Albans by multiple witnesses and was seen still on the bus at the last stop before arriving in Bennington. Somewhere between the last stop and Bennington, Tedford vanished. Strangely, all his belongings were still on the luggage rack, and a local bus timetable lay open on his empty seat. Tedford has never returned or been found. Tedford is just one of a number of mysterious cases of missing people from around the Bennington area in the 30s and 40s.
Number 7.
In the early morning hours of October 3, 1955, a merchant vessel named the MV Joyita set sail from Apia, which is the capital city of Samoa. The boat was taking 25 passengers, 16 of them part of the ship's crew, and 4 tons of various cargo on a 2-day, 270-mile trip across the South Pacific Ocean to the Tokelau Islands. The vessel had problems from the start. It was actually supposed to have left port the previous day, but was delayed due to the port engine clutch failing. When she finally did leave the next day, it was with only one engine. On October 6, the port that was supposed to have received the Joyita reported that the ship had not yet arrived. Since no distress signal was received, authorities assumed the worst and launched a massive search for the vessel and her passengers, primarily aided by the Royal New Zealand Air Force. But by October 12, no signs of the boat or her crew had been sighted. 5 weeks later, on November 10, a merchant ship spotted the Joyita near Fiji. She was almost 600 miles off course, waterlogged, and missing nearly all of her cargo. There was obviously no one on board, but the ship's emergency radio was tuned to the International Distress Channel, meaning that the captain had actively been trying to get help. All 3 of the boat's life rafts and the dinghy were also gone. From the outside, it was clear that something had gone very wrong. For starters, many of the boat's windows were smashed, and a makeshift awning cover had been put up over the deckhouse. There was also a large hole in the ship's superstructure, which, in addition to being adrift at sea for so long, had caused the lower deck to become completely flooded. But although the ship was found damaged and tilting to one side, the hull was completely fine, meaning that the ship was totally seaworthy. Most of the flooding was due to the ship being adrift and bobbing in the ocean for so long. The ship's odd angle was a result of the water that had come on board over the last few weeks. This makes fact that the lifeboats and dinghy were deployed not only strange but completely irrational on the part of the ship's passengers and crew. What's even more perplexing is that none of the 4 auxiliary crafts were ever spotted. Inside the vessel, however, is where things really started to get strange. The ship's logbook and all navigational equipment were missing. The medical bag of one of the passengers, who was a doctor, was found with nearly all the equipment removed and instead filled with bloody rags. The starboard engine was inexplicably covered with mattresses, which was possibly the worst attempt ever to plug a leak. The crew had also apparently tried to rig together a pump to offset the flooding in the engine room. It failed, obviously, but that at least shows that they were trying to keep the ship from becoming stranded in the middle of the ocean. But even with the engine room being turned into a swimming pool, the Joyita was still able to stay afloat. The fact that the ship's cork-lined hull and remaining cargo of empty fuel drums would keep her afloat should have been common knowledge to the 16-man crew. Taking aside the bizarre behavior and the bloody rags, what would possess 25 people to leave the safety of a seaworthy vessel stocked with supplies to go out into the Pacific Ocean on small life rafts, or what happened to them? On May 12, 1500, Gaspercourt reel radio had faulty wiring, and whilst still functional, it only had a very short range of 2 miles. This would explain why a distress call was never received. It's also worth noting that all the ship's clocks were stopped at 10:25. While that makes for a fun jumping-off point for wild paranormal speculation, it actually just means that ship's generator cut off during that time in the night. But that still doesn't explain what happened to the passengers and cargo. One theory is that the captain, Thomas Dusty Miller, got into a fight with his first mate, Chuck Simpson. The two beat each other up so badly, hence the bloody bandages, that they were incapacitated. This would have left the ship without an experienced seaman and also apparently would have dropped the IQ of everyone on board by 30 points. Another theory was that the Joyita was attacked by Japanese fishermen or still active Japanese Nazi forces. This line of reasoning seemed to be fueled more by post-World War II sentiment in the Pacific towards Japan rather than any sort of solid evidence. Other theories about mutiny and possible insurance fraud have continued to pop up over the years. But none of them can account for the fact that no trace of the ship's passengers or crew were ever found. It's very possible that the ship's cargo could have been scavenged before the Joyita was officially located in November of 1955, but even if the crew had all been killed by pirates, there should have at least been some type of wreckage discovered from the ship's 4 auxiliary craft. After being repaired and auctioned off to a new owner in 1956, the ship proceeded to run aground twice more during the next 3 years. A mechanical malfunction, due to improperly installed valves, would be the third and final straw. The Joyita's reputation as an unlucky ship potential death trap had made her unwanted and unloved. She was scrapped for parts and eventually purchased by British author Robert Maugham, who used the ship for inspiration while writing the Joyita mystery in 1962.